Hello, and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. In this tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to create a tree like this that you see here, using the sapling add-on in Blender 2.73. Now, this tutorial is going to be split up into a couple different parts, just because there's a lot of information that I'm going to be putting into these, and I don't want to make a really, really long video tutorial because no one will ever watch that. So, basically, it's going to be split up into the following parts. The first part will cover modeling the tree using the sapling add-on. We'll also discuss a little bit some of the things that we're going to be keeping in mind while modeling the tree, ways to position the branches and the splitting of the branches and other things like that. The next tutorial will be devoted to shading and texturing, and then the final tutorial will be devoted to final touches. And this is going to include things like simulating gravity that allows the leaves to droop like they would in real life instead of sticking out at real angles, awkward angles, and other things like that. So let's go ahead and get started by looking at a couple reference photos that I pulled for this tutorial. There are a couple things that you want to keep in mind when generating trees before you start actually generating them. The first thing is, if you look at this image here, trees generally form fractal patterns. You'll see that it starts out with the trunk at the base, and the trunk splits into two more trunks, and then those trunks split into two more branches, and it keeps splitting and splitting the farther and farther out it goes, and you'll see that there are only really a couple branches in the center of the tree, and that really most of the detail is on the outside. Now, this makes sense because if there were leaves growing on branches really deep inside the tree, they would never get any sunlight because they would be sheltered from the leaves on the outside. So it makes sense in that way, and it's something that should be kept in mind while working with trees, because sapling and other tree-generating programs, it's really easy to just generate trees that branch out all the way down to the center of the trunk, and it just doesn't look as realistic as it could be. Here's another image of a real tree, photo of a tree, where you can also see that effect demonstrated pretty clearly. You can see that it's not a perfect fractal like the previous one was, but you can see there are larger branches towards the center that split into smaller branches, and again, really most of the detail is on the outside of the tree. So we'll want to try to simulate that as best as we possibly can with the tools that we have to work with. Apart from that, I think we can go ahead and get started. So let's open up a new file in Blender, and the first thing you want to do after delete the default cube, we'll delete the lamp too, make sure you're using Cycle's render engine because that produces much more realistic results. I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-U to open up my user preferences, and I'm going to go to the add-ons tab, and I'm just going to search sapling and make sure that the add-on is turned on. If it's not turned on, just click that little checkbox over there to enable it. And now we can close that. Go ahead, press Shift-A, add a curve and a tree. Now, simulating trees, or at least remembering the settings that you used in the last tree and everything like that, can be kind of difficult, so we're going to save this as a preset once we're done with all of this, just because it's a lot easier to work with trees that way. That way you can go in, if you really liked a tree you simulated, you can make a little variety the next time you create it, and create a nice forest without any real difficulty and with a good level of variety. But for now, let's go ahead and start by clicking the bevel box. And as you can see, that actually adds geometry to the curves, so it's not an invisibly thin line. And I'm actually going to increase the bevel resolution to 4. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because sometimes these tree branches, they're not very smooth, especially if you look at them from the right angle. People generally don't notice that because another thing you do to smooth it out is change the handle type from vector to auto. But there are still issues, and the main issue is with the tree trunk. If I leave the bevel resolution at 0, you can see, if we zoom in really close, the tree trunk is really just a square. I mean, it's rotated, so it's more of a diamond from this point of view, but it really only has 4 faces. And it may not seem like much of a problem, but it doesn't look right when you go to render it, and then if you add a subsurf modifier to that tree trunk, then sometimes the branches don't connect to it properly, and it just doesn't look very good. So I typically bump up that bevel resolution to 4. Now, something I would like to add before I continue is that if you follow all of the steps to this tutorial exactly, you may have a difficult time simulating the tree, because this tree generation process generally works best on higher-end PCs. I'll try to leave tips as I'm going along for people who might not have very powerful computers to simulate the most realistic trees they can using the sapling add-on. So I'm going to go ahead and change the shape from 10 to flame to hemispherical. Now the kind of tree I'm trying to create here, I'm thinking it's going to be something like an ash tree. It's I don't want to say generic tree because that's kind of hard to define, but I have a pretty good idea in my head of what I want this tree to look like. And hemispherical, the shape works best for that. I'm also going to give this a random seed. I highly recommend you always give your trees a random seed. It's something that is forgotten a lot sometimes because it's just a little step there and it doesn't really make any visible difference until you actually put it with other trees. And that just adds a lot more variety. So I'm going to go ahead and go from there to branch splitting. And this is where it can get kind of difficult. Branch splitting and branch growth. I'm going to start out by giving this thing 2 base splits. Now, the base splits basically just split the tree trunk into additional segments, and you'll see this a lot in trees. So it's generally a good idea to try to add some base splits. Not every tree would have these, but I think it does add a level of realism when you do add them. And I'm going to tweak the branch numbers, but I'll do that after we bump up the levels, so I'll just work on this level first. And the very first thing I want to do from here is change the base size to 0.14. The base size, as you can see when I edited it, is basically the distance from the lowest branches to the bottom of the tree trunk. So right now it's at 0.4. If I lower that to 0.15, all the branches just sort of shifted downward, and they're a lot closer to the ground now. And I think I'm going to change this number of branches. I think I'm going to try something a little higher, like 75. Maybe that's not even high enough. I might try 80. Something that's often overlooked is the number of branches on a tree on the first level. It's very easy to start with a lower amount because you justify it by saying, well, I'm branching out into higher levels. But you do want to have a fairly high number of branches on this initial level, just because it looks a lot more realistic. And I think from here I'm going to add some segment splits to these branches. So I'm going to start out with a value of 0.5. As you can see, I did that on the second box right here to affect the second layer. Maybe I'll do a little bit lower than that, 0.45. I'll do 0.48, somewhere in between there. And as you can tell, if you look at it from the front or the side, it looks hideous. It looks like a complete mess. But we're going to be adding some curvature to this to make it look a little more realistic. And if you look at it from the top, kind of scroll in on some of these individual ones. Maybe I'll lower the branch number just to illustrate this a little better. You can see if we just look at some of these branches, already they look a lot more realistic. It's because the branches are splitting more in a fractal pattern like they would in real life. We don't see the tiny branches in the center towards the trunk, and it just looks a lot better already. But we will have to, we will have to clean this up a little bit to prevent it from looking like a huge tangled mess. I'm going to bring that back up to 80. And I think from here I'm going to work with the split angle a little bit. I'm just kind of going in order of the boxes that are listed here. I'm going to adjust the split angle of the first box, because basically if we take a look at this, our segment splits that we created earlier from the tree trunk are really close together, and it doesn't look very good. So I'm going to change the split angle to 15. And as you can see, that really helped a lot already. It's sort of spaced them out a little bit more. Looks much less grouped together, a lot better. And I think I'm going to add a little variation to that too. So we'll try maybe 25. That's even better. They're spaced out even more. The angle's a little more varied. Yeah, that works. And I think I'm going to work with the... I think I'll give it a little bit of rotation angle variation. I think I'm going to do that with the next level up though. Just to add a slight level of variation. I'm not sure how much that really affects the final result, but I add it anyway just to make sure there's a little more variety in there. Something else I like to adjust is the branch radius ratio. The higher this number is, basically, the smaller or the thinner the branches will be, and the lower it is, the thicker the branches will be. And I think I'm going to bump that up a tiny bit to 1.35 maybe. to make the branches a little thinner. And it may seem weird because they already look really thin, but these branches actually do look pretty thin in real life. The thicker branches are generally more what we're representing here with the segment splitting. And, okay. In case you're also wondering, it does look kind of weird that there are thinner branches below the segment splitting, but we'll change that as we adjust the curve resolution and other things like that. So I'm going to go on to branch growth now. And I think I'm going to start by adjusting the vertical attraction. We'll see if that does anything. I'll lower that to 0.35, and that doesn't really do anything yet because it only really affects the higher level branches. But I have found that you don't want as much vertical attraction as there was before. Basically, vertical attraction is how attracted the branches are to growing upward. So the higher this value is, then the more upward the branches will be angled. But you don't want to put it at 0, because there is a certain level of said vertical attraction in real life, since the branches are growing upward towards the sun. And the next thing I want to do is I want to change the length, because these branches are really short. Not the segment splits, but the second level branches. I'm going to try bumping that up to 0.5, and it is beginning to look more like the tree that I had in mind. It still looks pretty messy, like I said before, but again, we'll be fixing that when we're working with the branch growth here. And I think I'm going to give this... I'm going to work with the curvature a little bit too. I'm going to try a -10 for this to see if we can adjust the curvature of the segment splitting. Maybe a little less. We'll do -8. And as you can see, that sort of adjusted the rotation of this, the curvature of this. I'm going to give it probably some back curvature too. Basically, back curvature curves it back to the way it was before it was curved, and it can add some kind of interesting shapes. So I think I am also going to adjust the curvature of the second level branches. Now watch what happens when I change this from -40 to -100. You can see they all curved up pretty significantly. That's a little too significantly. As you can see, it sort of flipped the branches, so now the segment splitting is occurring more vertically than horizontally, but you don't want this too high, and I think that's too high, because the branches look really weird if they're shooting that far up. So I think I'm going to start with something like that, and we'll give it a little back curvature so we can see how that looks. Curvature variation, we're going to add any of that. We'll add a little bit. Let's 75 for that. Maybe 65. 75 will work. A lot of this is just playing around with the values and seeing what looks good. Sometimes it depends on how many segment splits you have. That'll definitely adjust the level of curvature and curvature variation and whatnot. And I think I'm going to lower the curvature variation on the second level branches. I'm going to try 10, just to make those a little more uniform and see if I can kind of clear up that mess. Now for the back curvature, again, back curvature just sort of curves it back and makes kind of an interesting shape. So I'm going to start with a level 4 maybe for that. And as you can see, it sort of bent this branch especially that we split from the base back a little bit. I think I like the way that's set up. Okay, so from here I'm going to adjust the curve resolution. You may not think that does much, but it actually significantly affects the segment splitting and the base splitting too, where the base splitting occurs. So I'm going to start by increasing this base resolution to 5. And as you can see, we didn't really notice too much of a difference in the actual resolution. I think this looks a little more curved than it did before. But you'll notice that the base splits moved much farther down towards the base of the tree. And that's sort of what I was going for, so that it started closer to the ground. I'm still not really happy with the curvature of these branches. I'm going to try -65. See if I can lower those a little bit. Something else that also helps if you're not happy with the curvature of some of the branches, actually going back to branch splitting and adjusting the number of branches can help with that. So I'm going to bump it up a little bit to 85 maybe. And that looks a little bit better. But maybe I'll go down instead to 75. Try 78. Somewhere in there will probably work. Okay. So from here I'm going to go back to branch growth. And I'm going to adjust some of these resolutions as well. I'm going to bump that up to 4, and I think I'll bump this up to 3. This is just so that when we get to those later levels, we have a little more to work with, especially on that final level. It does really help to add resolution because you can give it some back curvature and make it look like the smaller branches are more affected by gravity, which looks kind of neat. I think at this point we're ready to go back and start adding levels to this. So I'm going to go back to branch splitting and bump up the levels from 2 to 3. Right off the bat, it looks kind of weird. I mean, they're growing really vertically. And again, each tree has some level of that, but I think this is a little too strong. So first of all, I'm going to adjust the number of branches because I think there are a little too many. I'm going to move that down to 20. And again, this is just sort of tweaking it until you get a value that looks right. And I don't think we'll do any segment splitting for this one. Generally, I save segment splitting for the first 2 layers. Well, let's try it and see how it looks. I just hit 1 for segment splitting here. Let's take a look at this. So if we zoom in really closely, we can see that in action. Actually, I kind of like that. I think it adds a nice layer of detail to the tree. I still think it looks a little messy, so I'm going to see if I can maybe bring down that number of branches to 75, maybe even 65. That looks a little better. And I might bring down this from 20 to something a little less, like 18. Okay. So let's go back to the branch. Well, let's edit the split angle too, because if I zoom in really closely, some of these are split really close together. So I'm going to maybe make this 60. And that looks a lot better. That's sort of spaced out a little more. So I think that'll work pretty nicely. Already, this is looking like a pretty realistic tree. We can see, especially if we zoom in here, that again, towards the center, it's just the main branch that sort of splits off into smaller branches, and we have most of the detail on the outside, which is really what we're trying to achieve while we're working with all these settings. So I'm going to go back to branch growth, and I'm going to adjust the curvature on this, I think. I'm going to make this a little less. We'll make it -25. And as you can see, that sort of dropped them down a little bit. The curvature is kind of counterintuitive because it seems like the more negative the value is, the higher the branch grows, or the more vertically the branch grows. So the more positive the number is, then the more it's horizontally growing. So I think that should work. That looks pretty nice. Okay, I think I'll actually leave the back curvature alone for this one for now, because I'm kind of happy with the direction that these are growing in. Let's see here. I think the next thing I want to do, though, I want to adjust the length a little bit. No, I'll just adjust the length of the final level. I think that's a pretty good length. So, I think we're ready to add the final layer here. I'm going to give this a little bit less curvature variation again to maybe try to straighten this out a little bit so it's not too chaotic. Make that 65. And let's go back to branch splitting and bump up the levels to 4. Now if you're running on a lower end PC, your computer may or may not be able to handle this because it is very processor intensive to bump up the levels that high. But I think if you can do it, I think it's necessary because it produces much more realistic results. And I think the number is probably okay. Well, I might bump that up to, we'll say, 13. Just add a couple more. Wait for that to finish loading. And I think that should work pretty well. I'm gonna adjust the curvature a little bit in the branch growth. Just because if we take a look at this really closely, they're just sticking straight out, and it looks really weird. This is the reason I added the extra resolution down there in the curve resolution. We changed it from 1 to 3, because I was hoping to add a little more curvature to these branches so that they don't stick out so straight. So I'm going to try 100 right off the bat and see how that goes. And wait a second. There you go. You'll see that they really bent down. Maybe that's a little too far. I'll try 50. Do half that value. Again, the more positive the number, then the more horizontally they will be growing. And I think I like that. So if we take a look at some of these up close, I don't know how well you can see them because these are pretty thin. It added a little bit of curvature, and it added the curvature down, so it looks like these tiny branches are actually being affected by gravity. And it's a really subtle effect, but I think it does add more to the realism of the tree. So I believe that's it for all of the tree trunk and branches. So now really the only thing left to do is to add the leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and go to leaves. Before I do that, I wanted to say something quickly about pruning. Pruning is sometimes used, in case you haven't noticed, there are some of these branches that are sort of dipping down below the base of the tree trunk. I've always found that in the case of that, in the case of generating natural trees in general, assuming that they're not under the care of someone, maybe they're a tree in someone's front yard or something like that. I'm talking about actual trees that grow out in the wild, that aren't tended by anyone. I think it's always best to avoid the pruning. You might try it a little bit to sort of adjust the shape, maybe taper the top of the tree, but in terms of trying to use it to cut off these branches in the bottom there so that they're not dipping below the trunk, it's really not a very good idea. It produces very unrealistic results because it sort of squeezes the branches inward and it doesn't look very real. So I think it's always best to try to work with something like this manually after the tree generation is complete. So with that out of the way, now we can move on to leaves. And I'm going to change this from hexagonal to rectangular, just because we're going to be using image textures for the leaves, and there's no reason to have an unnecessary complicated leaf shape. And I'm going to lower this leaf count to 2. And I'm keeping it so low just because we have a bunch of different branches. With all the segment splitting and the different levels, looks like my computer's kind of having a difficult time keeping up here. There should be plenty of leaves. And I'm going to change the leaf distribution to hemispherical. You should always adjust this to make sure that the leaf distribution shape matches the shape of the tree. Otherwise, you might end up with some kind of weirdly arranged leaves. And the leaf scale and leaf scale X. Sometimes these values can be a little confusing because you tweak one and then the leaves become rectangular instead of square, and it's kind of weird. The thing that I typically do is I leave the leaf scale X at 0.5. Oops, it's 0.6. And I've found that if I leave the leaf scale X at 0.5, I think all that does, basically whenever I leave it at 0.5 and I adjust the leaf scale, it generally seems to stay as a square shape and not a rectangular shape. I'm not sure exactly how these values work in that way, but if I leave the leaf scale X at 0.5 and then I can adjust the other one, it generally turns out square instead of rectangular. So that's what I typically do. A common mistake that people run into here is they make the leaves too big. And I've done that multiple times on previous trees I've created before this. It's actually somewhat surprising sometimes to look at photos of trees and see really how tiny the leaves are in comparison to the general scale of the tree. So I'm going to make this 0.2. And you can't see any of this yet because we haven't actually shown the leaves. But once we do that, then maybe we can get a better idea. So I'm going to go ahead and show the leaves and hope Blender doesn't crash on me. Shouldn't crash. Sometimes it just takes a while to load. And there we go. So that looks pretty good, I would say. At this point, you want to sort of take a look and make sure that the leaf scale is okay. I do think the leaf scale is okay, keeping in mind that the leaves, when we're working with leaf textures, the leaves are always going to be a little smaller than the squares that we have to map them to, just because it's very rare that you'll use a leaf texture that will fill up the entire plane. So it's always good to assume that the leaves will be a little smaller than what you're seeing in the viewport. Now, I'm still seeing some of these outside branches. I don't think there are quite enough leaves. But instead of adjusting the leaf count, I'm going to adjust the number of branches on the 4th level. Something to keep in mind when you're working with leaves and the number of leaves is that you don't want clumps of leaves. You don't want really tightly packed clusters. It really doesn't look very realistic, especially since it looks like they should be pulling down on the branches a little bit more. And of course, leaves wouldn't grow like that in real life because they need to access the sunlight. And they don't get enough sunlight if they're held together in tight clusters. So I'm going to go back to branch splitting. And I'm going to increase the number of branches on the 4th level to start out with 15. You want to work up the number of branches very slowly just to make sure that you don't put too much strain on your computer. And it typically doesn't take much. Okay. It's still looking a little sparse on the bottom of the tree there, but I think this will work. And I don't believe there's anything else. If we sort of look at it from the underside, you can see that there are still some leaves inside, and we're going to end up clearing some of those out because there's still a lot of tweaking that we need to do when we're done with the tree. So that pretty much covers it for the sapling add-on, though. And I think from this point we can do a couple little tweaks really quickly to adjust the modeling, and then I think I'll wrap up this tutorial and we'll move on the next part to shading and rendering and texturing. So make sure before you do anything else that you have all of the settings in place, that you don't want to change anything, because if you try to modify the tree manually in the viewport, you will lose all the settings on the left. And I'm pretty happy with all these settings. I think I'll leave them the way they are. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to geometry, and I am going to name this preset, let's call it tutorial, and I'm going to export this preset. Now, this preset, if I go ahead and open this up, I can show you where this is located. If I go to Program Files and find this, wherever you have Blender saved, mine is in Program Files. And I'm going to go into Blender 2.73, Scripts, Add-ons, Add Curve, Sapling, and Presets. And these are basically just a bunch of Python files that are stored in here. You can delete these. You can rename them, and then all you have to do is come over here and click Load Preset to load the ones that you've created in the past. Now, there are a couple problems that some people might run into. Again, this one, it may be Windows specific. I don't think it is, but in my case, I had a problem when I was initially trying to save these. I would export the preset and I would get 2 error messages, and I finally realized upon reading the error messages that the folder had administrative properties, and basically Blender needed administrative properties to overwrite it and actually write something in the folder. So I had to go to the presets folder, and I had to go to the properties and security, and I had to basically edit the security or remove the folder's administrative properties. So I already exported the preset, everything's in place, and I think it's probably time to go ahead and edit this. So the first thing I always do when I edit these is I select the tree trunk, go into edit mode, and I select the base of the tree trunk, Control L to select the whole thing. It's still a little hard to see. We're going to have to select each individual part just because we split this into multiple segments. So I am going to, it's really hard to see past all these leaves. So I think first, before I do anything else, I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode and press Alt-C and convert this to a mesh from a curve. So now this is a mesh object, and I'm going to right-click the leaves and press H to hide them, and then select this again and go back into edit mode. The reason I was trying to hold off on this is because there's a lot of detail in this mesh, and Blender gets a lot slower when you start working with it this way instead of curves. So again, I'm going to just select a vertex there, press Control L to select the entire trunk, Shift right-click another vertex there, Control L to select all of that, and then there should be one more segment in here. This is running really slowly. It is much, much more responding when we are working with curves. So I'm going to Shift right-click this, Control L, and I'm going to press P and choose Separate by Selection. Now the reason I do this is just because I generally add a lot more detail to the tree trunk than I do to the tree branches, just because it's the most visible out of all of these. And it's also a little easier to texture, because I have different ways of texturing the tree trunk than I do the tree branches. So the first thing I generally do, really all we have left to do, is kind of work with this tree trunk. I basically go over here to Modifiers, Add Modifier. We'll add a Subsurf modifier, 2 levels, turn on Optimal Display to hopefully help with this a little bit. And the first thing you'll notice is, right off the bat, we have a little segment that's kind of sticking out, and it doesn't look right. So I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit Mode, Alt right-click to select that, and Alt-Shift right-click to select the next loop, because it looks like they're kind of stacked on top of each other. And I'm going to press G, Shift-Z to move them only along the X and Y axes and not the Z axis. And you just sort of have to do that a couple times and kind of play around with this to see what you can end up doing to remedy this issue. And it's not going to be perfect, but it'll look alright because most of that will be covered by leaves anyway. So the only other thing I think I want to do is I want to select the tree trunk again, and I want to add a displacement modifier. And I'm going to go ahead and add a new texture. And we'll come over here to the texture panel, and you can see we already have the displacement texture loaded. So I'm going to change this from image to movie, image or movie. I don't know why it's set to that texture by default, but I'm going to change it to clouds. And I think I might bring up the depth a little bit. And I'm going to lower the strength significantly to about 0.1. And you'll notice that it looks a little weird and kind of blocky. That's because if we go into edit mode, these faces are really, really long, and they're more rectangles than squares. So what I typically do is press Ctrl-R in edit mode, scroll up with my mouse wheel, and double-click to add a bunch of edge loops to all of these. And I typically do that to the whole trunk, including these branches all the way up here. But I think in this case, it should work just fine to have it only on the lower part. And I think that's it for this part of the tutorial. So for the next part, we're going to go into shading and texturing, and I hope to see you on the next one.